is the Pledge of Allegiance. If you're willing and able, please join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, so the first item on the agenda is the consolidated action. That includes board meeting schedule, non-represented employee benefits and compensation, and employment contracts, addendums, and employment contracts. So is there any item on the consolidated action that board members would like to discuss? Vince.
So I don't have anything I want to pull. I just wanted to express my appreciation for the move on for our senior staff taking a pay freeze during these uncertain fiscal times. So there's a lot of people struggling all over the country, and it's a very nice gesture and very meaningful. At OSBA, Kristen and I also are taking a pay freeze as well. So I think it's important for those of us that are privileged to be able to work, to sacrifice a little so that others can do well.
Absolutely. I would like to echo your appreciation and gratitude for our board members, for our leadership, and for Ryan. Thank you very much. Anything else?
Yeah, I just would like to, again, I just would like to express my gratitude to our leaders who made the decision to do that. It's a conversation that is hard to have, but important to have. And everybody stepped up quickly to make that happen, because we know where we're heading into some challenging economic times, and where we can save now will make a big difference later. So again, the gratitude to the team, and it was the right decision for us to make.
Thank you, Ryan. Very appreciated. And it is something that's really reflects the values of the organization when the leadership shows those actions. It's really, it's very meaningful. And being part of several organizations, I can see how that sets the tone and shows the care. So we appreciate that.
Yeah.
All right. If there is no further comments or discussion, I would like to entertain a motion.
I move to adopt consolidated action.
Do I hear a second? All right, moved by Vince and seconded by Sarah. Is that correct? Who did second the motion? Sarah?
It was
okay.
me.
Okay, thank you. So is there any further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I would like to take a roll call vote. Vince?
Aye.
Jay?
Aye.
Tina? Therese?
Aye.
Sarah?
Aye.
And I vote aye. Passes unanimously. All right, the rest of the meeting is going to be including the session 5 training for Oregon School Boards Association Promise Scholarship, which is a program, which is a training that's we've been very fortunate to have with OSBA and with our staff. So for those who are listening in, it would be advisable if you go to the meeting packets on Board Book, and you would be able to see an outline, a general overview of what we will be talking about. So now I'll hand it in to Kristen and Ryan.
You want to take it from here, Ryan, since Sabrina and Joe are starting, or?
Sure. Sammy and I were just talking about how well we did last time with the muting each other. We spoke too soon. No, that's okay. So really tonight we wanted to come together as our final OSBA training module with the Promise Scholarship component. And so we wanted to start by coming to conclusion on the work that's happening around mental health. And so there's a couple of topics we wanted to cover. The first was mental health services in this new format. Moving on from there to think a little bit. Are you having a hard time hearing me? No, you can hear me.
I hear you fine.
As do I.
Okay, sorry about that. We're getting all the bugs worked out at the beginning of the meeting. So the three things we're going to talk about was mental health in the time of distance learning, an update on financing related to mental health services. So Joe did a quick primer before, but a little bit more detail about that and the work with getting the licensure piece set up. And then the third component is going back to those elevator speeches you worked on last time about what's the importance of mental health in relations to public education. And so we'll have a little bit of time to work on that. And then we'll turn it over to Kristen, who will be finishing up on the conversation that happened after the board completed their evaluation and some of the next steps that came from that. So that's really the intent of this evening, is to spend some time finishing up the conversation around mental health and helping you to feel more prepared for conversations about that as it relates to public education, and then next steps that you saw based on your evaluation. So that's the plan for the evening. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sabrina and Joe to cover those three topic areas.
Vince, I want to acknowledge that I knew that you were shaking your head, not because you couldn't hear Ryan, but because Ryan said talking about mental health during this new circumstance. And I knew that what you were doing was going, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. And that's exactly what that head shake was. So Joe and I've put together a little bit of work we're going to share with you this evening. And it does kind of pick up a little bit where we left off and backtrack a little. We had a really nice opportunity to connect with the 3 board members who weren't able to be present at our first session. So that's nice because I think we're all coming in more or less on the same page. But I do think we don't back up, but I want to, again, kind of balance a little bit of work around context and content. And then we are going to talk about kind of relevancy under the circumstances we're working under right now. And then as we look forward, knowing that some of those circumstances aren't going to shift in the near future, and what does that mean for the work, and what does that mean for what we're up to?
Thanks, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great.
Sound good here?
Mic system was going all right. We have some prepared slides that we're going to be using as we walk through this process. So we're going to share into those. And as Sabrina said, sort of review some material and go through some data that I know folks have been interested to see. So I'm going to get that presentation moving.
We are going to tweak your elevator speeches, so you should have those with you. You're a little bit off the hook as students because the only person I can really grill in on is Sammy. But I can't see anybody else, so it's kind of up to you whether you're what your integrity is tonight. So we are starting back right here, which was a reminder that health and wellness is one of the key goal areas that the school board has settled on in their 5 goal areas. What I thought was important to do was take a look at why you landed on goal areas. And I think that that's captured here, which is this belief and intention that all students have the ability to reach the full capacity of student academic achievement, and that we believe that that gives students the opportunity then to leave their tenure with us with the whole range of opportunities ahead of them. And that our belief as a school district and your belief as a board, that identity and that whole list that is there, and I think there's probably things that could even be added to that list, would not be predict or predetermine this kind of success. And so I just draw your attention to that briefly as a reminder that this is what this work is built on, is that this is the ultimate goal that we're looking to move towards, and that these are the kind of the flags that you have put down to say the markers around what you stand for in terms of your belief in all students who live and come through the Corvallis School District. With that in mind, our building administrators have done an activity that I want to draw your attention to, which really looks at this idea of kind of spheres of success. I think the first thing to note is that success is a little bit of a subjective term, but in the kind of the context of this conversation, I go back to that idea of this kind of full capacity of academic achievement, and that we want to see students reaching that. And what we have asked our building leaders to do, and they've done these activities with their staff and with each other, is really look at where do students fall if these are our options. And what we see over and over again is that students from our more marginalized communities may fall outside of that center sphere. And then we talk about why and what is it that means that students fall outside of that, and how do we move them into that circle so that we know that we're obtaining that ultimate goal that we've talked about. So as that conversation has happened in buildings, we have seen the same pattern come up over and over in those conversations. And often I actually reference Matt Boring pretty frequently here in a conversation with him, where he recounted to me why his students hadn't graduated student by student, and really named the things that came up. And after that conversation and conversations with many leaders, we landed collectively in this place where we could really see the thing that was missing. And that brings us to this idea that the work around racial equity, around culturally responsive teaching, the need to develop skills that come through collaborative problem solving and health and wellness bring us to a place that brings students out of those outside spheres into that inner sphere of success. And that's something that we see as a primary goal. We see that come up in your 5 board goals when we think about real world teaching, building relevancy, having rigor. All of those things kind of are what we see moving students into the sphere of success, so that we know they're getting that full capacity. And what we know is that one of these bubbles is health and wellness. What we also know is they overlap each other all over the place. But this particular work that we're talking about is health and wellness. We talked about that before when we came together, and that's kind of what we're coming back to again. I only resurface this because I think it's important to remember kind of now, why are we here? Like, why is this a conversation that we're having? How does this relate to the things that we have prioritized and said that we need to attend to?
One thing that I would add in that conversation too is many of you have heard Sabrina and I talk about the concept of integrated mental health care. And I think this graphic is something that we've developed really to talk about what does integrated educational and mental health care look like? And looking at all the different components in our conversations, not only internally, but with outside partners, we've been quite clear that components around culturally responsive teaching and racial equity are vital for people to take the steps that they need to take to make integrated healthcare work in a school system.
So we move from that and we shift into what is the current state of affairs. When we last met to have this conversation, aside from our conversation yesterday with a few board members, we were all in the same room. So that was like, I don't know, 8-9 months ago, I think. It was a totally different ball game. And we talked about all of the things that the mental health program was up to. We talked about all of the priorities that were associated that. We wooed you with our very interactive activities and reflective journal writing. I'm guessing we were funny because we usually are, or at least I am. And so I think that was a charming time. And what I want to assure you is that while we're now doing this on screens and somewhat separated, our content actually hasn't changed. And I think it's important to talk about why that's true and how that works right now. I think that's also true because we have certainly made that subtle shift away from distance learning being this thing we were suffering through for a few months to something we now think about in a much more long-term kind of way as we look towards the summer, as we look to next school year, and as we've really settled into whatever typical becomes, it won't ever actually be where we were. And so what does that mean for this initiative? What does that mean for this work? And that's also why I think it's important to start by looking at those initial slides to remember that while typical has shifted, while the format has shifted, our goals and what we are trying to accomplish have not shifted. Our priorities of students and families and how we want to connect with them and provide them the most kind of rigorous, relevant education possible has not changed. We are thinking about that differently in format.
So we'll start by bringing you back to this graphic, which I'm certain many of you will now be quite familiar with. We've had it as the foundation for how we describe our work since the beginning, and really just talking about the technical aspects of how are all these things showing up in a distance learning environment. Starting with the school-based mental health centers, much like they're easiest to describe because they describe staff, they remain pretty easy to describe. In a word, they're just continuing. The Oregon Health Authority has expanded the capability and permission to do telehealth services to nearly all covered OHP services. Many clinics pivoted quite quickly. Our clinic actually pivoted, I would argue, the fastest, if not the second fastest. Along with the Old Mill Center here locally, we went online almost immediately when we began to suspend classes.
Therese, I see you. I see you having a question. Maybe you're just going to make us guess. No. All right. Well, maybe you can just jump in. Jump in when you have a question.
Okay. So we continued on with operating seeing clients remotely since the district distributed devices to students quite quickly. We were able to engage a lot of telehealth services quite rapidly. We also have a HIPAA encrypted ability to use Google Meet. So that's meeting our standard to ensure that we're connecting with families in a secure and confidential fashion. In terms of social emotional learning and growth, we've done a lot of work with our school counselors and our building teams right away to talk about care and connection, which are the two key elements of distance learning. And we've been able to really bring mental health sensibilities into those discussions, supporting our school counselors with additional training and professional development, and doing a lot of work with them to help ensure that they're acting as the green zone intervention, trying to connect with as many students as possible. It's also allowed the school counselors to do some amazing work developing social emotional lessons that are deployed across many buildings. When we look at amplification of existing programs, there's been extensive discussion about inclusion and not missing students. Specifically, we've worked with teams to redevelop their SST process. That's the student support team that all buildings use to staff cases. All of our buildings are running those on a weekly basis now, and they're using that not only to discuss the academic issues, but to identify the social and emotional struggles that are showing up in distance learning. It's also a key point where buildings are identifying students in need of physical resources that we're working to distribute. That's actually the biggest part, which is the philosophy of caring for students, how we've connected out into our community to provide services. A lot of our district office staff have done some tireless work to develop a distribution center for food and material resources that at one point, for a couple of days, it was a very brief period, was one of the only food banks available to residents of our community. We've also continued that work in talking about access to internet and other kinds of communication technology that are vital for the educational component, but also for social and emotional health. This is a partnership that we've had with a lot of our other community providers who were looking to us to make sure that some families that they wanted to reach had devices to be able to engage in telehealth with them as well. So we've been able to facilitate medical services for partner agencies and providers as well.
So when I think about two of the main goals beyond providing literal staff to provide services that we had talked to you about before was the ability to infiltrate staff into building teams to raise the capacity of teams overall as they serve students and families. At that time, we weren't preparing for a pandemic, but it came in quite handy that that's the work that we had been up to and that was the work our buildings had already started to engage in, so that as we shifted into a pandemic, in this case, our buildings were well kind of fortified and ready to hold the depth of services and connection that became necessary as we think about what families need. And that's only just kind of grown. I think the second piece we talked about is this idea of how to connect with the community and community partners in a way that's meaningful, that really invites them in to this work around really connecting with students and families. And it's been really encouraging to me to see that that work continues in a virtual platform, and that partnership has continued to grow as we think about how to reach out and how to connect. Vince, I see you raising your hand.
Yeah, I'm really excited about what I'm hearing. I just want to get a little more clarity, or at least can you talk about in a little more detail on how the SSTs are detecting and then responding to student need. So it's kind of more of a nuts and bolts discussion. So for me, I mean, I don't know what that looks like. I don't even know what it looks like for a teacher to be teaching right now. So yeah, if you could add some details so I can have a little more tangible understanding.
Of course. What it looks like right now is teachers in buildings are having regular check-ins with students, and it varies based on grade level and some of the content areas, but they're having areas where they have students who are able to join in often live Google Hangout meetings, and also have communication via various other electronic means, submitting work and having comments back and forth. Teachers are taking note of students in those meetings and the work that they're submitting and communication that's going back. Where they see students that are either exhibiting struggle, if students look stressed or are having a hard time, where they're seeing stress in the background, because we have a little bit of a window into families right now, or alternately, where students aren't showing up at all. They're circling this information back to the building's SST, and those conversations are happening amongst those professionals to identify how we can reach out to those students using a variety of means. Sometimes a trusted member from the building will give that family a call. Sometimes we'll send notes. Sometimes we'll reach out in different kinds of ways. We've even done some things like sending families care packages of snacks and activities that they can do, along with personalized notes, and delivering those to their door. A few of the buildings at this point have also become concerned about some families they haven't seen for a while, to the point where on a very limited basis, using social distancing, they've gone out to visit families' homes to check in on them. So we're using a lot of different means to make sure that no family is completely disconnected from our interactions. In that, we're having a lot of conversations with families. One of our district office staff said earlier today very clearly that a lot of her work is focusing on interacting with parents right now to support them in the tremendous strain that they have engaging in this distance learning in the middle of a pandemic.
So I want to answer that only a little more, Vince, in a technical way too, just to say, and I think we touched on this before, but it's a good time to reiterate this, is that the SST is literally the building leader, the school counselor, the mental health staff, the special education teacher, a gen ed teacher, behavior support staff, potentially a health navigator, and those staff all come together, an ELD teacher, right? And they kind of sit and take this look at the building at large and hold the kind of weight of who needs services, what are those services, how do we connect, how do we make that happen?
It almost sounds like a triage team, because I'm assuming that you have more need than you have capacity to meet. Like if you had more people, you'd probably have more touches. There's probably a lot of need out there.
There's a lot of need, and there's also the strain of the limitations of how to sort out what that need is. And I think I would also, this is actually where I'm headed now, so it's a nice segue. Part of the truth too is we have pretty good systems now in place and practice for people who are navigating crisis. But it is a different scenario for families that are potentially navigating crisis for the first time, that haven't had that before. And when we think about things that creep in like shame or stigma, it can prevent people from reaching out. And so we're just constantly trying to sort out, how do we continue to reach out to families so that they know we are here and that that's an okay thing to do. And that's tricky. That actually leads us into where we're going here. So when we talk about what's the current state of affairs, we wanted to talk you through two things. So one of them is literally, what is the mental health program up to right now? And that's why we kind of walked you through that model to show you kind of what does that look like. The second piece, though, that I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you a tiny bit about stress. And the reason I want you to do that is because I want to continue to help build some context for you in understanding where the mental health program needs to show up and why that becomes critical if I go back all the way to the beginning circles, and why things become important if we're trying to move students to the closest sphere of success, and how does stress right now play into that. So I'm going to walk you through just a couple of slides here that are going to talk about stress. And I want, no, go ahead and go back. What I want to be clear is, first and foremost, that it's not my work. The majority of this work is done by Bruce Perry, and we've talked about him a little bit before, but he's done just phenomenal work around trauma and the brain and stress. And during this time has actually done just an awesome job of doing these kind of weekly office hours that anybody can listen into, as he talks about the impact on our social, emotional, and mental health right now during this pandemic. And just kind of reiterate some of his work around stress and trauma and the brain, and how that impacts not just how students are accessing learning from distance learning, but how anybody is accessing any kind of flexibility, adaptability, and resiliency. So I'm going to walk you through these pretty quickly, mostly because I am in the boardroom. And so if I go over time, Ryan is within us, close enough to be able to like kind of throw something my way and tell me to speed up. 8 feet. Yeah. I'm still not done with that slide. So I want to talk you through this just really quickly. So what we know about stress is that stress is actually good for us, right? We need stress for our bodies to function. We need stress to be able to grow and learn. We actually need stress for our systems like cardiovascular to actually do the things that they do. But what we also know is that there are two ways that stress can go. So if you look to the left there, what you see is kind of unpredictable patterns of stress that are extreme or prolonged. And what they create is a level of sensitization. I want to clarify that when we talk about sensitization, we're literally talking about being sensitive, not what is often misused as desensitization, which would mean somehow you would become immune to stress. And that's a mischaracterization of that word. Sensitization literally just means you're becoming sensitive. And that means smaller amounts of stress can give you a larger response. If you look to the right, what we know is that predictable, moderate, controllable levels of stress actually build resiliency, strength, all the things that we want to have healthy lifestyles. What's important about this slide to me right here is when we think about being a part of a pandemic, what we think about is the level of unpredictable stress that's happening outside of us. Today, I listened Ryan talking to the entire staff, well, those who chose to listen, at length about having to make hard budget decisions, and about having to predict what programs we need to have in place in the fall. And all of that is based on things that at this point are relatively unpredictable. Will there be a second wave between now and September? Will there be a second wave? Will it come in November? Will it come in July? What does that mean for schools, right? These are unpredictable levels of stress that we can't control. What does that mean for us as we try to create then predictable, moderate, controllable levels of stress for ourselves, for our staff, and for our students and families? You can move now. What we also know then is that these levels of stress have to do with kind of how we operate on this kind of level of growing and learning and reacting. So this is just a basic chart, right, that shows you that if you're sensitized, you are higher up on the left side there, you operate at a higher level. And what it also means is that your baseline can start at a higher level. So the more sensitized you are, the more likely that your baseline could be alarm. So it takes a small amount of unpredictable, uncontrollable stress to send you up into fear or terror. Where if you're more neurotypical or even resilient, your baseline is a lot lower. It takes a lot more stress and unpredictable stress to send you up, which means you have a much higher tolerance for stress before it sends you up into alarm or fear or terror. What that means for us right now is we think about what our students and our families are up to. And for me and for Joe and for our staff, we are also thinking a lot about what our staff are experiencing. So when we think about where your starting point is, your baseline, and then what's the impact of hearing Ryan say, I don't know what the fall will look like, but it will likely be this or maybe this. Oh, and it will probably change a few times next year. That for lots of people who have a calm baseline with moderate levels of stress, that might be somewhat alerting or alarming, but I can then recenter and continue to think about what my job is. But if I'm a staff member who maybe has a higher baseline, hearing that information might send me into fear or terror. We think the same thing about our parents, right? Parents who are going to be hearing this information, who are starting to hear this information. Where is their current stress level? How does that send them up? And where does that put them? And then we certainly think about that with our students, who just the mere information about whether or not they're returning to school could be really alarming to them. But also what's happening in their homes. What does home normal look like anyway? And now we're in our homes all of the time. So when we think about this reactivity curve, it becomes really important to think about not just what we knew when we met with you 3 months ago, but what do we know that we've now layered on a whole different kind of stress for many of our community members and our students. And what does that mean about their reactivity? And how do we counterbalance that with effective mental health work so that they still have an opportunity to access their learning? So I go all the way back to the beginning when we talked about if our goal is academic achievement, and we know that these are the things that keep us out of those circles, then what we need to come to is a sense of how do we help people kind of keep their stress level low, even though it's unpredictable? And how do we build in something with our students and families that continues to keep them regulated so that learning is even an opportunity? And that brings us to this last one right here, which has to do with something we call dosing. So this idea that having a staff member check in on a kid and a family once is great, but is actually not going to provide the level of regulation that is needed if distance learning is something I were actually going to access and participate in. If I'm going to really continue to go online and look at what my teacher is assigning me, think about it, participate, be creative, all of those things. But what we do know and what research has shown is that dosing small levels of positive, connected, healthy interactions lowers your baseline and allows you to then stay at a calm, alert, alarm level as opposed to fear or terror. So when we think about what our mental health staff are up to right now, they are even more critically trying to have small doses over and over and over again with students and families to lower down that baseline, as well as the work they are doing with staff, which is pretty substantial at this point, trying to do the same thing, helping staff to feel calm, alert, or alarm, but not fear and terror as they think about how to do this job.
The one part I'd add, and I know there's some questions after that, is this concept of dosing and frequency is already being echoed in some emergent research around therapeutic deployment. And we've seen locally in some of the work of our partners where we've seen reduced session length working with kids, but increased frequency. And there's some emergent research to suggest that that actually may be part of adapting a psychotherapeutic or mental health model for a distance or remote environment.
I see you, Vince. You're one of the 5 people on my screen I can see. So I see you first, but somebody else probably has a question. I just can't see them.
I think Jay was up before me.
Okay, then we should definitely start with Jay.
Well, thanks. Will you talk about the picture of the student that instead of showing fear, terror, and alarm, covers up and says, I clearly in these times am not cut out for this kind of work. I am just going to say, I'm not involved. I'm not going to turn my work in. I'm not going to, I'm getting further behind than when I was in class. These descriptors on the left talk about what one kind of stress is, but what I'm seeing as a student teacher supervisor, and I was going to mention this at the end of the meeting, but I'm talking to some people in the Mid-Valley that are high school teachers, and they see way bunch of kids, and this may not be the group of kids that we're talking about, who are just absolutely checking out because they don't have that teacher engagement, and they're feeling further and further behind. And so their reaction is not any of these on the left, but it's either cover up and go depressed, or act out because I don't want to act like I'm dumb, so I'll just choose to act out, and then you won't call me dumb, but you'll call me, misbehaving. So I'm wondering, will you get to some other types of reactions, or is this the kind of student only that we're going to talk about today that's going to go alarm, terror, and fear?
Yeah, so I think the piece I want to say about that is you just listed students who are in alarm, terror, and fear. What you listed is students who may internalize that emotion and show that in a way of withdrawing or showing that through a more depressed state, but it's still the same feelings. So when you think about, I don't want to show up in that virtual platform, I look stupid here, I don't know how to navigate this, that's actually still just fear. But when we talk about how that fear is manifested, I'm choosing to check out. I'm choosing to not play. I'm choosing to sit in my room and just feel kind of down and out. The 5 emotions that run up the left side here are universal and generalized across the board. What you named is the reality that the way those manifest in behavior is a huge spectrum across the board. That can look everything from big, fat, externalized behaviors to really small, withdrawn, internalized behaviors. And we've spent a fair amount of time with our mental health staff over the past year, actually really talking about how do you draw out those internalized students to know where they are and who they are so that you can attend to their mental health needs in the same ways that we do with externalized behaviors or externalized mental health dynamics.
Thank you.
I would add that the concepts on the left, when we look at the escalation through fear, alarm, and terror, refer to a specific neurological pathway. And the end of that neurological pathway is what we call the triple F, fight, flight, or freeze. So when you're at the top of that, the most extreme versions of terror look like people fighting or being explosive or dangerous or disruptive to others. Fleeing, people just literally fleeing in fear from a circumstance, or freezing, which is a form of disassociation where people really just check out and they stop and they become frozen almost internally, even though they have a whole lot going on. So seconding what Sabrina was saying is this is describing a little bit of an internal process. And I hear you, Jay, speaking a lot to that outside behavior.
I see Vince and Sarah, I think.
So I just want to confirm my understanding. A lot of the discourse we hear right now around student outcomes is that students are falling behind from where we would expect them or where we would like them to be because, for obvious reasons. What I'm hearing here is that not only is that the case, but children are also going to be neurologically predisposed to or not be able to handle I want to say intensive interventions, or be less able to handle intensive interventions to catch them up. Also, I'm hearing that staff, because I think we're all experiencing certain levels of elevated stress due to the pandemic, I'm just seeing a system-wide lowering of capacity to make up the ground that we have lost or will have lost over this initial part of the pandemic. Is that correct?
I think that's true. I think, though, that I would want to highlight that I think that this is a place where race shows up. So when I think about one of the dynamics of whiteness in particular is the focus on productivity, the focus on progress and kind of check boxes, right? And we know that to be true. When we look at kind of internationally, when we look at other cultures who are more relationally based, you see huge times where cultures have undergone trauma or events that have happened. And there's this understanding that care and connection and relationship is the kind of the key to that time, right? That's how people thrive. That's how people care for one another. And that's actually what brings about health. So not that I'll go way back into my anthropology days of undergraduate, but I will a tiny bit to say there's actually some great research, right, around communities where the care and connection was so strong that you actually see stronger health outcomes, not in a surpassing science kind of way, but in a where people come together and bind in ways that they can to serve one another, right? And then the care and health of the community rises up. So I get a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I want to come back to, yeah, it's true that if a student is elevated in fear and terror, giving them a really strong intervention for the reading they've lost is not going to be effective. But that was true before the pandemic. When we were in classrooms and kids are are dealing with food scarcity, that's actually also getting in the way of them getting a good reading intervention. And yes, I think we will see that and do see that already on a heightened level right now. I also, though, think this is a place where we have to kind of hold both. We want to be providing academic rigor. We want our students to be moving forward, right? Ryan has been pushing us and asking great questions about what does the fall look like so that we are really providing something of substance to our students and families. I believe that, I hold that, I honor that. And there is a truth to, we've actually not only, but only been in a pandemic for a couple of months. And as it is true that whiteness will show up in that space in a, where's the product? Where's the next thing? Like, have we got this done? Can we mark this off? And I do want to always come back to care and connection is actually first. Care and connection, are people okay? Because that intervention will not be productive if people are not actually connected and okay.
I really
I would say
appreciate.
as well, this has really shifted and highlighted the work that many teachers do to co-regulate with students. And it's forced them into a space where they have to learn new co-regulation techniques. Many teachers are very good at sharing physical space with students and projecting an energy that helps calm students and provide predictable, foreseeable, structured organization in their classroom. Here, this has highlighted that the dose has to be much smaller and much more focused. So we're building capacity in staff members to be able to do direct co-regulation, reflective listening, reassurance, validation, and talk through those things, which is definitely growing some spaces and growing some capabilities.
I really appreciate the comments here. I agree wholeheartedly. You know, although your starting slide, used academic achievement as the measure for success, and I don't completely agree with that statement. I think that we want our children to be relationally ready to become adults and be productive. I think that would be a regular outcome that we would expect, or I think that our community expects the school district to help our students become, fully formed human beings ready to be engaged in the world. And it's not just about academic success. So thank you very much. And it sounds like this is something that I don't hear other people in education talking this way. I think there's a lot of emphasis on academic outcomes and catching up. And I think that this is a conversation that we're going to need to start having, particularly, you know, in the special session and into the next biennium.
Mhm. Sarah, I think you had a question a while back, and I don't want to lose track of that.
Yeah, so thank you for this. I spent my day with a child who was just at the end of her rope.
Yeah.
With online learning and stress, and it has been a long day. Which leads to my question. I mean, this is a kid whose parents are both still employed. She's got a supportive environment. But I've heard from a lot of parents, and I'm certainly feeling it myself this week, everyone's reserves are at an end. Kids are, the novelty of this, if there was novelty to it, is worn off. Parents, I am staying up way too late because I'm trying to get my actual paid job done at the same time I'm teaching, keeping a child with ADHD learning. So I was wondering what information is available to parents and families who may not need, big interventions, but may just need some tools so that they are more able to cope with things. And because we spent the day talking about, it's okay not to finish. It's okay to just say, I need to go outside. But I think everyone's struggling with that. So what are we doing for families? Because I'm feeling it right now.
I feel it too.
Right there with you, Sarah.
You don't sound much different than I did
Yeah, I'm sort
about
of on the edge
40 minutes
right now,
ago. I think there's a couple of things there, Sarah, that I just really appreciate. And one of them is that I appreciate you being honest. As a parent who's trying to homeschool and do a job at the same time, that's not a thing, by the way. We're just pretending it's a thing, but it's not. And it's incredibly hard. And so I just appreciate you saying that as somebody who feels very much the same and has cried a lot, especially recently. So I appreciate that. I also appreciate that one of the things I heard you say there, which is, one, what are we doing for families who potentially are seeing and holding stress that's just not typical in their home? And I think that the place I hear this coming up frequently is things like, all of a sudden my kid isn't liking school, and that's never happened before. Or my kid suddenly doesn't want to do anything around school. I've never heard him or her say that before. Things like that, where I think they are able to articulate things like, my child is suddenly really teary, and that's not typical. Or my child is not eating very well, or my child's a pain in the rear about every house chore where that normally wasn't a thing, or maybe it was, right?
Yeah, you
And I
just
think-
described my children. So thank you.
And that's what we're hearing. And I think what's important about the piece around that you named is that's a strain on kids that we're not sure what that is, right? And that's where we actually have to go back to, what do we know about stress? What do we know about transitions? And that, what do we know about kids? Kids are really resilient by nature. That's actually true. But things like transitions and stress and change really activate our rhythms to be off, and it's really dysregulating. It's dysregulating for adults and for kids. And where does it show up? Well, mostly at the most annoying time, like right when you're in the meeting and they decide that that's the moment that they're having their meltdown. But it also means that it shows up in ways that we're not typically used to seeing. And I think part of what we have started to talk to our mental health staff about is, how do we get some communication out to families that says, you might be seeing this. So we had one of our therapists who actually wrote that up, who happens to work at Franklin and Jefferson and Hoover. And she wrote a letter just like that went out to all of the families that said, you might be seeing and hearing this, where you've never seen or heard that before. And here's what that might mean. And here's what you might want to be able to do. And I think the part you point to in that right there, again, is something like a pandemic that brings on unpredictable, uncontrollable stress will shift everyone, even those who typically, where it wasn't a big deal. And I also appreciate, just for the good of the order, the whatever luster was there is worn off, because boy, I felt that today when my son was like, I'm not doing school for 6 more weeks. And I was like, yeah, okay, so homeschool appeal definitely has lost its appeal. And I think that that's not uncommon for what the experience is right now.
Thanks, Sarah. I would add the other piece that we're trying to do a lot of things as well at the district communications level to try and get messages out in lots of different ways. School counselors are developing lessons that are being sent home for students, but we kind of know parents are watching those too. And we're also trying to just send out good, positive messages. This is Mental Health Awareness Month, and so it's really important to be getting that out. For those of you who haven't seen the Mental Health Monday messages, they're great. A lot of our staff across the district have developed some great work. And I would really just encourage as well, everybody who's watching, just remember deep breathing, like deep, long, slow breathing. The longer that you exhale, the lower your blood pressure is going to go when that occurs. And so slow rhythmic breathing is a really great way to regulate your own emotional state and lower the current status in your body.
I would also like to remind you, though, that for some of us, being told to deep breathe is a really dysregulating thing and will likely lead to no breathing and a much higher state of alarm for someone in the room. And so it's good to be sneaky about how you make that request.
I want to just step in here just for a second. That's like told, like, why don't you just calm down, right?
Yeah, not effective. Let's just remember.
I just want to make sure that you guys are okay for time. I know that board members are curious. We're asking a lot of questions. I just want to check in on that.
He's not glaring at me.
Always a good sign.
We are at about 7 o'clock, so we probably have about 30 more minutes to cover mental health. So
We're fine.
it's time to talk a little bit more about the transition in terms of the funding structure, as well as the your individual work that you've done around communication around health services.
We're okay then. Okay, moving forward. On that note, moving forward.
Oh, jumped a little bit. So yeah, I wanted to present a little bit of the data that we've been able to pull over this year. So a lot of this material is pulled from our electronic health record. We're working on a few pieces that we haven't been able to pull because we have to do some data integration with our student health system, but we're going to highlight a lot of the demographics of who we're serving and then talk a little bit about the financial circumstances that we could be in through the rest of this year and the beginning of next. So first off, over this year, we've served 172 clients, and this is a breakdown by age. Actually covers some students quite up into the 14-year-old range, where we've worked a little bit with some siblings of older kids, and all the way down to some littles in the 5-year-old range, centering mostly right in the center of elementary school. This is a pretty even breakdown of students, but when we look at the breakdown by gender, we actually see a real big difference. And this has a lot to do with generally how boys present in behavioral disruption as opposed to girls. So while there's actually a pretty big spread of different issues that students are struggling with, little boys tend to show it very clearly in classrooms. And I think this is a space for some growth in our teams. I know that there's a couple of buildings who've had some really innovative practices in identifying internalizers, kids who have emotional stress that they sort of pull into themselves, as opposed to externalizers whose behavior is a whole lot more visible in a classroom.
To Jay's point.
Yes. When we look at the services that have been deployed over this year, and this is to date to the end of April, I haven't pulled May data yet. We've deployed 873 hours of skills training time and 1,128 hours of mental health therapist time. That's across all our buildings aggregated. This is really important because hours of service are sort of a component by which we can estimate our overall fee structure and how we would be able to make the program fiscally sustainable. As you all know, this program is currently about 50% funded by the general fund, and the other 50% is funded through our Medicaid dollars that we already received through our MAC time study data. When we look at the fee structure that exists within the Oregon Health Plan, it's set at a state level. Those are fees and compensation rates that are decided on a regular basis, and they shift a little bit, but not dramatically, based on how the state sets rates. Currently, the May data shows that an hour of psychotherapy delivered by a master's clinician would net $172.56. With that 1,128 hours of service, that would mean that had we billed everything that we did this year, we would have had $194,000 in the bank. That's a pretty substantial number, and I think is a good structure of known data. These are values that we can pull, that we would be able to look at within our health record and are concrete. Vince, did you have a question?
So what does that mean in the context of the overall personnel cost of the program?
That would be a little under half, in the sense that that would probably be 2 therapists and a skills trainer. When we look at estimations, and what I'm going to show you is estimations based on aggregate data that I've looked at over this school year, trying to smooth out some numbers and project into the future. So these are estimates, I'm going to say that clearly. We would see that approximately we would have $287,000 for next year. That is roughly equivalent to half of the FTE for the program. So when the board set out on this project, the goal was that within 3 years approximately, that it would be fiscally sustainable on its own. I think that we've done a lot of forward-looking work this year to try and set in place a system that would allow us to become sustainable much more rapidly than that. And I'm happy to say that we are on target to get about halfway next year. A really important piece of that has to do with the fact that we're working on finalizing our contract with IHN, which is Integrated Health Network. That's the local OHP coordinated care organization. For those of you who remember my long-winded talk about Medicaid, you'll remember that OHP covers a substantial number of students and adults who need mental health care. Specifically, they cover almost 60% of the students that we serve in this program. And that has to do a lot with the needs and how those needs for students who are vulnerable and come from marginalized communities often have higher levels of trauma and stress. I wanted to take a moment and see if there were other questions.
So I have a follow-on question. So I know this is preliminary and, you know, we won't know. I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We don't know anything. But does this bode well for expansion of the program? I know one of the other goals is that we would love to do this in secondary schools as well. Does that look like that we would be able to make that fiscally possible as well, looking forward?
Eventually. That's not our intention next year,
Yeah.
I think, at this point, given the obvious. But I think that as we look to the future, yes, we feel confident that we are on a projection to building a program that will sustain itself, in which case that we would then have the option to make determinations to add. I know that the middle school in particular is eager to have that expansion happen, and I can appreciate and respect all of the whys behind that. So that's certainly still in our purview, and I think is something that's fiscally possible.
The other part that I would say within that, sorry, Ryan, did you have a question? Is that what I've displayed here has to do with billing services as if we were in a fee-for-service model, specifically being able to get payment for things that we would deliver. There are a couple of other pieces that we're exploring right now, having to do with some statutory changes that are moving through the Oregon legislature, expected to have Oregon administrative rule in the fall, having to do with other services that we can bill and things that we can add into this that I did not include because they're not known, and it's very difficult to predict how those rules are going to fall out at this moment.
when you came up with.
Thanks for the exciting news. This is really encouraging.
Survey data billable, or it was set
Yeah.
up in that.
This is all separate from our MAC time survey data. I can say I don't have the exact data. I was waiting for that. And I didn't get a chance to integrate it into this presentation. I can circle back with the board as well. We have had an increase in our MAC time survey data this year. And the amount of that increase, I can get back to you on.
But I think it's important that we think about
Mhm.
half the costs associated with the program. We're also receiving money through time survey and some other things that we've been able to do historically to enhance mental health services. So, yeah, I think it's just important to know that this is distinctly
Mhm.
one way of receiving.
Yeah.
Is your mic on, Ryan? I don't know if they can hear you.
So the time survey is something that happens 3 times a year, and it's for staff across the district. And there's questions about, did you connect families with resources basically during your workday? And they use that as sort of a baseline for that period of time, which is like a 3-month period of time or a quarter. And then you receive some additional funds from the feds related to that. So that's something that we've had ongoing, but it's something we also continue to do outreach to our staff to help them to recognize the value of completing that and what it means for our overall organization. So it's another source of revenue that's gone primarily to mental health services and support over time.
And I'm happy to report about that specific time study process, which is a pretty massive piece of work that we owe to Aaron Womack, who's a tremendous staff who works here in the district office to manage that we were able to even deploy that when the state set our targeted date. They gave us a date to do this while we were in distance learning. So we were able to actually engage in that process during distance learning.
Which is amazing and actually speaks to 2 things. One, the work that Aaron, but building leaders, district office staff, the work that has happened to educate staff across the board about the value of the work in connecting families with resources and serving families. That meant that we ran a time survey in a pandemic on a virtual platform and actually did exceptionally well, because that is so much what staff are up to and they're aware of it and we're able to report it, which is just awesome. I know. I feel the same way, Vince. I feel the same way.
So moving on a little bit, talking about this is sort of what we have paid for. This is what the payment structure would look like. I did want to share, this is actually what students are struggling with in real time. I pulled this based on our assessment data. These are the top 10 diagnoses, indicating specifically, these are things that students may have maybe one of these, they may have multiple diagnoses. But I can tell you confidently that a quarter of our student population that we have served within this program struggles with post-traumatic stress disorder. Approximately half of that student population has some form of attention deficit disorder. And a third has some sort of family disruption or distress, possibly separation or divorce, possibly just family distress in their homes. And about half of students have some form of anxiety disorder, some sort of internal stress or anxiety that they're struggling with. This year, we completed 110 suicide risk assessments. These are screens that are conducted largely by school counselors, and this year at our elementary level are followed up by mental health staff in some cases. These screen students to determine, is there a greater risk of suicide attempt or completion? I can very thankfully tell you we have had no suicide completions this year, which is really the number I care most about. But this number shows us that we still have an incredibly high level of awareness of students who may be experiencing serious crisis distress.
Joe, real quickly, what triggers one of these assessments?
I'm not sure who's talking first, Vince.
Yeah, it was Vince. Vince, I can speak to that just briefly. So it could be any number of ways. So one of the things that I can speak to, right, is we've talked about this enough that I think you'll recognize it, is we've done QPR across the board, and that work has been championed by a number of our health and wellness staff and family and support staff here at the district office. And that QPR training, right, ultimately raises the level of awareness. And one of the things that I think has been really helpful is by Ryan's strong leadership in that area, it's given us permission to really universally train QPR. And what that means is the answer to that is all over the place: conversations, student writing, students reporting for other students, staff reporting based on, right, all of the things that have happened. And what enables that really has been very strong training across the board to all staff through QPR, which raises that awareness, which means those risk assessments are happening in response to so many different kinds of reports, which is a great thing based on that means all people out there being aware and looking out for that.
You have a system.
Also be
for that.
bringing on,
Yeah, exactly, Vince.
sorry, my sound isn't working as well, Vince, I apologize. We're also going to be bringing on 6 more staff members from across the district, including mental health clinicians, school counselors, and actually a high school principal into our core of QPR trainers. So we'll have an even more enhanced capacity to deliver that training to our own staff in the future.
And then Jay, do you have a question?
I have a couple of background questions. The slide before, you said there are some diagnoses, not tonight. Could you get us some sort of descriptors of what those would look like? One was something about stress achievement or achievement stress. If you could give us a paragraph or two about what those look like. And then secondly, your suicide assessments, is it just the students you are working with that are K-8, or does that include high school as well?
This is everyone,
Okay, thank you.
the entire district. That process is universal, not just K-5.
I assumed that, but I wasn't sure if that number was coinciding. Okay.
I want to speak just quickly to capacity there too, remembering that one of our goals was to raise the capacity of staff to hold and understand mental health and wellness. And one of the benefits that I see from QPR across the board is obviously this awareness for students. But we also are seeing it as staff look out for each other and other staff. And we have had staff who have reported concerns based on conversations they've had with staff, where we have been able to get mental health involved and support staff as well. And I think one of the pieces that's so important about that in a school system is that while students are at the center, and that is what draws us all together, that we firmly believe this program is built on understanding and taking care of people. And that means really continuing to see our staff as people in that equation. And one of the things that I think is critical is to not underscore that mental health involvement in our schools is about students and families and about staff. And because we know that a whole healthy system means that everybody does better. And I think that that's an important piece to name as well. So at this point, we're going to make a transition to your elevator pitch. What we've done tonight is continue to kind of build your depth of knowledge around mental health. What we've also done is talked specifically to what's true about this distance learning time, as well as we look into the future, which is unpredictable and uncontrollable, and how that impacts our program and how critical the program has been. One of the things that I think is important is to come back to the work that we did initially when we met last time, which is part of your role as a board is to be able to speak to why this is part of your board goals. Why is this a place where you have put money? And that conversation just became particularly important. And I want to name that explicitly because I think that the question that comes next is, well, how do we talk about why we're paying for mental health in a budget crisis, particularly when, wait for it, that's not what schools do. And so I want to pull you back to the information that we know that's true, which is we're doing mental health work because we know who kids are, and we know that we have to treat the kid as a whole person in order to help them be academically successful. We know what Vince said, which is that people in Corvallis are interested in their kids coming through this system as whole people who grow and learn and develop all the skills, the hard skills and the soft skills. And I also think it's important to remember that in a budget crisis, there is a temptation to see those extras as extras, like racial equity work. When we get into budget crisis, this is the time where suddenly those pieces seem like extra things we tagged on. But what we know is if our work is about bringing all students to that sphere of success, we cannot ditch off the things that we know are what keep students out of the sphere of success. And that's why it's really critical that we feel grounded in why are we doing the work that we're doing? Why is it where our money is, but also why is it where our time is and our conversation is? So what we had hoped to do is to give you an opportunity to revisit your elevator speech and see if you need to adjust it to make it current to the times. Knowing that Ryan held a 45, more like 48-minute session with staff today to talk about what a budget crisis means and what it means to not know what school will look like next year, but that it won't look like anything we've ever had before. And I think those two things might impact your elevator speech. So I think what we'll do is give you a few minutes to actually just work on that. And then we want to make sure to have a little bit of time to check in with each other before we're done. I love that Sammy is saying, how long can my elevator speech be? The general, like if I were going to Google elevator speech, is that it's 2 minutes. You actually can have up to 2 minutes, but just think about your pace. So somebody's 2 minutes and my 2 minutes are not the same.
I feel like I can be confident in saying that even if it's 2 minutes, I think the conversation that you might engage in would be longer than 2 minutes.
Mike's not on.
We're going to give everybody until 7:20. And then that gives us 10 minutes to come back together and share out.
I'm just going to step away quickly while you are all engaged in that. I'm not leaving your meeting.
Sounds good. See you soon, Kristen.
Okay, it's 7:20. Time's up. Because in the efforts of time, what we're not going to have you do is share with the timer like up on the screen so we can point to it when you're at like 5 minutes and well over your 2-minute. We're not going to do that. What we would like you to do is to each share a phrase or sentence that you particularly like from your elevator speech or feels strong to you or something that captures something that really resonates for you. So take a second and look at it and pull a phrase or sentence out. And then we'll have each of you share that before we transition. Okay, Vince, why don't you start? Because I can tell you're ready.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what we were discussing earlier. The sentence is, and the fourth area of work is developing a philosophy of caring for students, not just teaching them reading, writing, and arithmetic. And then I go on to talk about, another sentence, scaffolding that and emphasizing that we're raising whole human beings. We're not just putting information in their heads.
Thank you. Sarah, do you feel good to go?
Only if I unmute myself. Yes, so my last sentence is, our goal is to give kids the resilience and skills to adapt to the uncertainties and realities of the long-term pandemic so that we can all move forward successfully.
I really appreciate that. Sammy?
Yeah. I'll use my first one, and it's 3-line sentence. We believe that every student can and will succeed and graduate. No, never mind. The need for providing our students' needs require a wraparound support services in our schools to help them grow as a whole person who is resilient and successful.
Jay?
I'm glad you let Sammy and Vince go first, because that gives me also. So I say my key sentences are, this program is more needed than ever. And as far as expense, I think I heard it's about 50% self-supporting in the coming budget year, whatever number, you'll help me get that clear, is critically important. And the offset of expense that we will gain by retaining students in the long haul is also money in our bank. And that's crass thinking, but when people start talking money and kids, you have to start reminding them. And when those kids don't drop out and don't leave your schools, you're keeping their money. So, and that's not where my heart mostly is, but I'm going to remind them when they worry about money.
I still like that math though, Jay. Tina, ready?
So I just believe that as a district, we all believe that all students are important, and part of that is meeting students where they are and bringing them from what we could do to bring them from struggling to thriving. And if that means, we bring our mental health providers and clinicians into our buildings, and that will help alleviate some of the barriers that that our families face in the community to access mental health.
Thank you. I love that you use the word thriving. All right, Therese. I know, I can't tell if I need to like make faces at her or what. We can't hear you. Oh, there she is. Can't hear you.
Let me try.
She's not muted. I've had this issue with Zoom lately where
Okay.
Let me call her. Would you like to go through the phone?
Just a second. Let me see if I can. So you can't hear me at all through there?
No.
Testing my mic, and
I can hear you good now.
You can hear me good now. Okay. Wow. It's on. What about now?
Could you try again? Could you hear her from that one?
No.
I think, Therese, you need to do join voice from the Zoom. Yeah, I'm not sure there.
I have no idea why it's not connecting. It's so bizarre. Okay, well, can I
Yes.
Okay. So I will say, let's see, where was I? Okay. Okay. Providing school-based mental health clinics brings another lens toward comprehensive care and inclusion. Let's see. Everyone needs social, emotional learning and support. Everyone has room for growth. By including mental health services, we are normalizing that everyone has ups and downs. And I can't read the rest of my sentence.
I really appreciate that, Therese.
I really appreciate that, particularly the piece about normalizing. When I think about what happens in that moment when Sarah says, I just had a really long, hard day. And I think, oh, thank you. Right? That's the small version of how normalizing works.
All right, I'm gonna hang up with Sammy and see if I can figure out the audio.
Sounds good.
I appreciate you sharing. I appreciate the time as we continue to grow in this work. So thank you.
Thank you all. Really appreciate the opportunity to work with you through this.
And I wanted to again recognize Joe and Sabrina and the work that they've done over the past year to really see this program develop. So it's been really remarkable to see and to see some of the results in terms of the students we've been able to care for in pretty insubstantial ways over the last year. Sometimes there's so many things that were not predictable about this, but in terms of having additional layers of support for kids right now, it makes a huge difference. And so it's been a value for the district and a value for our kids and families. So a big thank you to Joe and Sabrina for joining us tonight.
Thanks
And then
so
I'm
much.
going to excuse them because they have, like many of us, kids at home that need to be put to bed or cared for. And so I'm going to go ahead and excuse them. And with that, I'm going to change it or transition over to Kristen to talk us through. Oh, wait, there's a question from Sarah.
Well, before you leave, I just want to express my gratitude for you and for everyone in the district who's working to support our kids, because we had no idea when we decided to invest in this how critical it was going to be. And I just feel like as we move forward, even though our coffers are going to be pretty empty next year, the needs are going to be so great, and the work you all have done to get us in a place where we can really provide for kids is so important and critical.
And I would love to say to you before you go, I have been really honored to be part of the team of learners here on the board. I mean, I have really enjoyed every session with you all, and the information that you have brought has been outstanding, and the way that you've worked with your board is what we try and train staff to do when they engage with a board. So, so thank you for your efforts, your work with kids, the focus on the importance of this. I had a meeting with Ryan and Joe and Sabrina the other day, and we were talking about how, like, you know, there are some in the community that feel like this kind of work is extra, but as you have all talked about tonight, like, this is the time to do this. There is no better time than a focus on equity and mental health and supports and those kinds of things. And so I just, like I said to you earlier in the year, and if there were gonna be a big convention this fall, you know, like, I would say, please come and share what you do. But I really do want to find a time for you to share what you do, because this is good stuff for all of Oregon. And so I want to remain in touch with you. And again, I appreciate your focus and your approach so much. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Jay, I see you.
Thank you. And I pushed a button, and so I don't see my face. So if you can see me, that, or even you can hear, that's the important part.
We can do both.
I wanted to say thank you to both you and Joe and Ryan, because you are good leaders. You are key, and it is the right thing to do. And I think the other thing that hit me as we were hearing from Sarah and Vince, and I think Tristan was actually sharing about her family. It's so good to have people who are leaders who have kids in the trenches, and it matters. It tells everybody you're working with that you aren't just talking from an ivory tower. You are really leading from your own experience as well. So thank you for the good information and good leadership, all of you.
Thanks, Jay. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Joe and Sabrina. That was great.
Oh, I was like, they logged off, but they're with you in the same room, aren't they?
They are, yes. More than 6 feet apart.
I won't do it. All right.
We maintain social distancing.
You know what I would say. Okay, so that is a wonderful segue to the focus that the board has had on and what you all came up with in these goals. And I'm gonna, if I can share my screen, I don't know if I can. Let's see. Somebody give me permission.
It might take you a few seconds.
Okay. Yeah, no worries. I'm just gonna bring up, I'm sure you have the
Now you can.
Great. Let me share our agenda. So to wrap up our PSP, the main thing that I want to focus on for you is, and you've done this, you've established this work last time. Joe and Sabrina bring wonderful information that you can build on and continue to answer the question, what is the board's role in all of this? And so as you can see, I went through the notes from last time. I sent this out. Most of you answered the questions that I sent out, and so I've got everybody's individual answers, but I tried to find themes. So I'll show those to you next, and hopefully that will guide you too. But I wanted to just bring up the draft areas of board focus and see what you think about these. Public engagement and communication, and racial equity and implicit bias. And this is, I won't read these things out loud to you. You have this in front of you. But I want to get your sense, first of all, on your thoughts on how this was summarized. Does this work for you? Can you buy into these, for A and B, these areas of board focus? Let's see. Vince.
Yeah, these are exactly the when I went back and reflected on my notes, after going through the board self-assessment, these bullet points really parallel nicely with what I had in my notes. So I'm really enthusiastic about these.
Great. Other thoughts? Anything that stands out as missing or something you disagree with, or does this capture your conversation? Hearing none, because I know you would tell me if you disagreed with something.
Yes.
The one thing I'd add
Yeah.
is that under the public engagement and communication, down at number 5 is the one about the board should seek opportunities to educate the public. And I heard that sort of embedded in in so much of the conversation before. I think it almost just needs to move up further into the body. I mean, I don't think it can be number 1 because the board needs a clear definition of public engagement. I think it needs to be can't be ahead of that, but I definitely don't think it's sort of like the far end of the bookend, because I see it so important in all those other factors of public engagement.
And I wonder if it's, oh, go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, I agree with what Ryan's saying, and I think better public understanding of what we do, what our role is, will help with the explanation of what we do and what and how and why we do what we do. We don't. I don't plan high school graduations, so there are things like that somebody asked me about that, and can you make this happen? And the result is a frustrated constituent. So I think a better understanding of our role makes a lot of the other things on that list easier.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder if it's number 2, because I was thinking the same thing you just said, Sarah. Like, if that's the next thing, the rest of those sort of roll out from that. When the board knows what you do, then you can get to the why and the ways to reach them, etc. I didn't put these in any order of importance, but I also know that there is a perception there, right? When you list things by number, then there is a perception of a value attached to how high something is on a list. So what do you think about moving that up to number 2? Okay.
I have a question of why wouldn't it be maybe even number 1? Because I guess what I'm thinking of is our communication with the public. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to get confused, but
you might need to define it before you can do it. Vince, go ahead. Did you have a response to that?
Well, and I think that, defining what communication, public engagement means for the board is a conversation that we do need to have with staff, because that's something that we need to do in parallel with our staff and district communication.
Anything else on A?
Yeah, I want just to echo also what Vince mentioned in terms of when we work with staff. When we work with staff, we need to be clear that there are limited resources, whether it is for individual board members or staff time, and having really clarity of understanding of how we're going to engage publicly on different topics and different times of the year is going to be sustainable in terms of staff time. I think that would be a very important aspect as well.
Is that something that you would want to include in the wording here, so that it's not just assumed, or what do you think?
I don't know. I'll leave it to the board how they think about it. If we agree on the sentiments or the direction, probably I'm okay without listing it there. But also, I know that's sometimes assumptions are not good to be just assumed on in mind and not put in paper. So what the others think? Should we state that clearly, or is it an assumption that we can work with?
Is it, let me ask you this. Is it part of your board culture, mindful of staff capacity and time?
I believe so.
If you feel like it's embedded in your culture, you probably don't need to necessarily call it out, right? There are a lot of things you could put in writing that you don't necessarily need to call out, but I think that's a good question to ask yourself. Like, is this part of our system
Yeah,
that we don't need to call it out? If not, then, then you might consider it. But if it's part of the way that you all operate, and your superintendent operates, and, that's just part of what you consider, then I think that it's probably an okay assumption, but that's
yeah,
your decision.
yeah, I agree. It's part of our culture. Ryan?
I would add that if we had just had board election and we had a new board coming on July 1, I think we would need to be more specific, but that's not the case with this board at this time. So I think that that's understood in the culture.
Great. So I'll make that change. I can send this back to you. What about B? What are your thoughts on B? Sarah?
Yeah, so the only thing, this is another thing that sort of is bringing the employees of our district into my thinking too, that not only do we need to continually seek training, but we need to also be actively supporting the training and development of knowledge and understanding of our staff and employees in the district.
Would you want, Vince, do you want to add to that, or since?
No, finish that thought.
Well, I wonder like what the board thinks about, because this is pretty specific to the board, but if one of your areas of focus is also to ensure that you are allotting resources so that staff can participate in that too, then maybe there is a space for some wording in number 1 about, you will, and I think, Sarah, tell me if this is not what you were saying, but I think what you were saying is, yes, we need to focus on this too. And part of our focus should be that, we resource our staff to be able to do the same thing.
What about also ensuring that there's staff engagement with the board? Kind of like what we just did around mental health. Could we have staff engaging us on this particular topic?
I mean, my inclination is yes, Vince, but I think we have sort of established a way of working where we have we have reports from staff fairly regularly, and I think that could go sort of under the umbrella is that we need to support the staff training and staff work in these areas. And I think it can be something that can be wrapped into number 1.
Yeah, I agree. We do have quite a bit of reports on these topics, but that's not exactly what I'm driving at. I'm thinking more of an engaged process where we're co-learning with staff on this topic, or they're bringing us along in work that they're doing, kind of like what Joe and Sabrina have done. It's more of a collaborative arrangement rather than sit and get from
Training.
Staff and then get to ask them about the work that they're doing.
Do you envision, because I have seen this model happen. Do you envision potentially doing training alongside staff? So if you are seeking out group training, is that something that you would do separate from staff, or are you thinking that, like maybe with your district leadership team, you would do that together with them?
Yeah, that's
So a couple of things I want to add. So
Yeah.
Kristen, we have been offering that through, an example would be Beyond Diversity, where board members have gone through The majority of board members have gone through that with teachers and staff.
Great.
The thing I would add to the conversation is that we have board goals, and in our board goals, there is a goal around continued professional development in this area. So in some ways, I feel like there's, not in some ways, I feel like there's support from the board to continue that professional development. And also there's an equity policy. And so I'm wondering if in that equity policy, so that's a policy developed by the board and approved by the board. So there's sort of assurance in that as well. So I feel like some of those pieces help to drive that message. At the same time, what I've heard Vince say a couple of times is that staff may get ahead of the board with regards to the training component. And so I don't know that I necessarily have a revision for the bullet, but I think as you think about it, or as this board thinks about it, be thinking about, well, we have these other pillars in place or structures in place. So how do we enhance those with this language?
And I will just say, in my experience, sometimes staff does get ahead of the board in the training, and that there's nothing necessarily inherently wrong with that. I try not to use examples from my own administrative history too much, but when I was at PPS, very large district, and so we had to roll out training to different folks at different times, different groups at different times, and it was more of a top down, and the teachers were the last to get it, and which was interesting because they're the ones working with kids. So I think it's okay if it's the opposite. It almost makes more sense if your staff who are implementing policy and working with kids and making decisions that are going to impact students are a little further along than you are. Not to say that that's not important, but I think it's also okay if you're not right alongside them. But that's my opinion that you didn't ask for. So I'll stop there. Vince?
I guess my hand was still up. No, I mean, I'm enjoying the discussion. I guess what I have witnessed is just a higher level of proficiency around, critical theory around race and bias and being demonstrated by staff. And when I was at Oregon State, I was getting that training as well, but they're really good at what they do. And so I just see them using, they just seem to be at a higher level of proficiency than the board. And it's to a point where I think that sometimes things get lost in translation a little bit because I'm just not seeing us as close to the level of proficiency that we need to be most supportive of staff. And it also sets us up for situations where there could be misunderstandings. Also, I think we have an expectation that we are going to be very progressive in this area, that we are going to be on the cutting edge of what is possible in school governance around equity. And I think it's certainly my personal expectation for this board and for this district. So I would just love to see it, and I want to learn with staff, and I'd like to do that in a collaborative way. So that's what I'm expressing.
So other thoughts on how that might either be expressed here or even the idea in general, or how the board, because Ryan, what I think I heard you say is that might be something that if that's not put into place right now, that's something that could evolve over time, or you've done work with staff before, that's something that could be part of this. I want to know where you all want to go with the language in this to encapsulate that thought.
And
I think I wasn't necessarily advocating for not advancing the language as much as if we're going to keep these other components in mind, because they might help us to further develop it, or we don't necessarily have to go back and create something that isn't established. So if we're going to do it, improve it.
Sarah?
I have loved the training with Joe and Sabrina, but I want to acknowledge that it's taken a lot of their time. This is what we think about with our staff. So I think my only qualm about including some kind of requirement of collaborative learning like we did with Joe and Sabrina in this language is that right now, especially, I am reluctant to put an expectation that staff will spend their time training us when there is so much that they need to be doing right now.
Jay?
I just would add to that. I know that we are saying that equity is a big, big deal to us. But of our 5 or 6 goals and things that we want to be focusing on, I think that we have to be concerned about diving too closely into staff instead of staying at a board level in our work. Which item do we not dive into that people would say, wow, you spent all this time on that area, but you guys are really slow on academic area and you know, I think the role of the board is to be oriented about what we're doing. But I think Sarah raises a practical point about how much time. And then I'm thinking an uneasiness about which items we're diving deeply into in what and how deep. I think we always have to be careful of. I don't know that this may be the right one to dive deeply into, but I'm just raising that as a caution. So.
And Vince, before I call on you, I'll just check in with folks that haven't spoken yet and just make sure that Tina, Therese, Sammy, do you have anything to add at this point?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, I fixed it. Yes. All right.
We
can
hear you.
I'm feeling extremely empowered right now, having solved a technology problem myself. So
And you cut the middleman.
I did. Gosh, this is gonna carry me through the weekend. There are all these things I cannot do.
Whatever it takes.
But I figured this one out. So I just wanted to, so on the subject of staff time and where it makes sense for it to go, I really appreciate Sarah's comment about, you know, wanting to make sure that the very precious time that our staff have is invested wisely in moving our district forward with best outcomes for our kids. And I think that, you know, at the board level, while it's really fantastic to have opportunities to know the ins and outs of things, you know, it's not the most important that we have that we experience that training directly, so much as it's important that we understand how the training is being used to support our district and our children as a whole. And one of the things I really appreciated about this is that I see this mental health training is that I see this as something that the community could push back on, that they could wonder why are schools taking this on. And so having this training provides a foundation for us to be able to, I think, advocate well on behalf of the staff in our district and the initiative that we have put forward, and really, frankly, the capital investment of a lot of money dumped into a very specific area. I think in a situation like that, it's super important that we can speak competently, that we're able to pull out a number and say, well, you know, they did about this many hours of something. So that's really impressive. But I think about those topics as things we might need to stump for, basically. And if I think I'm going to need to be able to, you know, bring rallying points to get somebody behind why we are doing something the way we are doing it, or why we chose to direct resources in a limited resource economy at the moment, then I want to have that level of depth. I don't think anyone is ever going to ask me about third grade science curriculum the way they're going to ask me about about this kind of something like mental health. And so in my mind, I'm thinking about, taking staff time when it helps us to move the whole initiative, the whole agenda, the whole system forward, and staying out of it when it doesn't.
Thank you. Tina, Sammy, did you have anything to add right now? I don't want to put you on the spot. I just want to make sure you have an opportunity.
I'll go after Tina unless Tina's good.
I'm still gathering my thoughts at the moment, so go ahead, Sammy.
Well, thank you, Tina. I think, yeah, I want to just reflect on my experience on this subject. I believe there are two venues. I'm trying to really summarize as well what I'm hearing from my my fellow board members. There's two venues where board development and learning is happening. The one venue in the boardroom and through reports and presentations, and also and more in depth through trainings, just like today's. The trainings are staff and time intensive. They consume lots of staff time, of course, but in some instances, just like today, they're very essential for us to carry the work of the board to advocate for policies and for funding, and also for community awareness and support for strategic investments. So I think it's been very useful, especially with such a very critical and strategic goal, to have in-depth training using board time, school board meeting time, and staff time. The other venue outside the boardroom that I found very useful is the trainings that Ryan mentioned, the Beyond Diversity and Courageous Conversations. And I know that there are plans for the gender identity policy trainings. That's what we're going to be having the opportunity to be involved in. And those are opportunities for us to see how the rubber meets the roads in terms of professional developments that staff get. And I have my understanding that this is not taking lots of resources, because we're getting a seat in the training, and hopefully we're not taking someone, I'm sure we're not taking staff seats. It's whenever there's availability and vacancy, we could be involved there. And I think that's a very good strategy and mix, which is we think thoughtfully. So to summarize, it's really thinking thoughtfully what should be in a board reports that Ryan sends on a Wednesday, or what should be in a board meeting where we would have a report and a discussion and a presentation. And also what are outside opportunities for professional developments that the school board members could be invited to. And I really like those multi-layer learning opportunities.
Well, based on
that, and that's okay. Based on that in the conversation, I don't know if number one doesn't actually say that, right? I think it says the board should continually seek both individual group training opportunities in racial equity, cultural competency, and implicit bias. So seek and individual and group training. So I don't know if that might just be, I mean, sort of as we've come back around to it, that might just be what we're trying to accomplish. But again, I think if you're thinking about next year and the amount of time and effort that went into Joe and Sabrina talking about the mental health work, and if we were going to have some similar sort of format and structure, probably including Marcianne, is that something where you would want to spend time throughout the year? It probably wouldn't be comprehensive in terms of full meetings like this has been with the work with Kristen, but to have chunks of the time associated with that work. And I have noticed that there have been questions that have been asked related to that work, that or to the work, that there has been some points where I thought I need to bring more information forward to inform the board. So I can see how that could happen potentially, but I don't think that the language related to B1 precludes me from doing that, I think it sort of continues to support it. I feel like I rambled a little bit, but and for all intents and purposes, what I wanted to say is I think B1 covers it. And I do see a value in bringing some of that work forward, because I have seen gaps that I've noticed that I should be working to fill in terms of educating the board.
I was just going to say, looking at that too, right before you said that, Ryan, as I was like looking at that wording, as you all are sharing, I'm like, I think B1 actually covers all of that, right? Because it doesn't eliminate the possibility of anything. Tina, did you want an opportunity? Do you want to share anything?
Sammy spoke well to what I have my thoughts already were, so I'm not going to spend any more time on that. But I just wanted to say that it is imperative to continue to do the training on equity and inclusion and racial equity and implicit bias. And if that means we do some of the training with some of the staff and as a cohort, that would be amazing. So that'll be, saving some funding and not paying staff outside of the training to do a separate training for us. And to just be mindful of our support for the staff as they go through, their trainings. And I think it's imperative to dig deep into this, because this is our vision, this is our, it's on our goals. And to move our district forward, it's imperative to have these trainings.
Thank you. Vince?
Yeah, I appreciate everybody's, I appreciate the discussion, and I certainly echo the concerns about use of staff time. But I think that, and I just would like to position the superintendent as kind of the gatekeeper on staff time. Clearly, the superintendent felt like it was a good investment of staff resources to educate the board around mental health, and that there would be some return for students on that education for the board. And I would just like to wrap this up by saying how the board operates and the decisions that the board makes impacts students, and it impacts student learning, and it impacts student experience, and it impacts those things for staff as well. And so having us well equipped to be proficient in our deliberations and the way that we conduct ourselves in session, and then making sound decisions, whether that be policy or resources or all the things that we make choices on, is crucially important. So what we're doing here isn't idle, and it's not a waste of time. It is important for student outcomes, and it's worth investing some time in developing ourselves so that we can do that work better.
Thank you. So we've got a suggestion to add the focus, to expand the focus in B1 to also ensuring that the board is focused on providing resources to staff to do their own training as well. Does the rest of the language cover all of the possibilities of working with them, working alongside them, working independent from them to your satisfaction? So if I go away and say that I know I'm just going to add another couple of words to the draft to have an additional focus on ensuring that staff have these resources too, does that cover it for you? Vince says no. Oh, Vince says yes. Okay. Sometimes a shaken head means yes. Okay, so I'll draft something up. I mean, you can continue to refine these things, but as long as I've got the spirit of what we're thinking, that I think that we can probably call that part good and move on. Okay, so I want to show you what I've compiled for your answers to the questions. Here we go. All right. So those of you that emailed me your answers to these two questions, you will see that you are not directly quoted here. You all had wonderful thoughts, and what I tried to do was pick out themes and try to make sure that everybody who answered the questions was also represented. If you feel like you weren't, please let me know, and I will apologize for that. But I tried to ensure that the things that rose to the top as a group were represented here. So the first one is, what did you take from the board's conversation about the board self-assessment? And what I heard from those of you that responded were, the board needs more training, and specifically in equity. And then, and some of you defined equity about, you know, that there are many components to that. There's racial equity, socioeconomic equity, white fragility, implicit bias, and all of the pieces that you have expressed an interest in. And then information on how to implement that training in board work. The board needs to better understand its role as both an advocate out there in the public and a two-way public liaison, right? So how do you communicate to the community, and how do you receive input from the community as well? And then how does the board become viewed as more accessible by the community? And what other stakeholders might be involved in helping you be more accessible? In a couple of your responses, there were indications that not that you want to be viewed this way, but that the board might be viewed by the public as not reachable, not very accessible. And I've heard you talk about that in meetings before too. And so that was an area of focus in a couple of these. Before I move on to 2, what are your thoughts about those responses? Does anything surprise you, or is anything really missing? That capture your feelings about the conversation? Okay. So then the next question was, in your mind, what is the board's next goal in continuing to focus this work? And I think that the conversation we just had and where you ended with Joe and Sabrina, this all comes together right here. And so the first thing I heard was that sharing the role of the board, which we just talked about, with the community, with community partners, with groups of folks, making sure that folks are educated on what you do and what you don't do is really important, and how you operate. And included in that was that two-way liaison. How do you receive information from and input from others, and how do you give information, provide information to the community? Integrating a formal equity lens into your own database decision-making process was important. And then making time for continued professional development and having tough conversations about things that are hard to talk about, which is how you move the dial. And so those were the big things. And I did not narrow to 3 on purpose. I just wanted to condense everything into a few things that you could really wrap your heads around. So thoughts about that second question? Anything surprising or misstated or really missing? Seeing none. Yeah, Sammy.
So I'll just, I like the one thing about number 1 groups is comprehensive and includes everything. One thing in my mind is I'm thinking of while I look at this is specific stakeholders, including the legislator in Salem, our federal representatives, since there are conversations around E-rates and other stuff about funding and supporting local districts. I think that would be, yeah, so that would be important to spell out in my view, especially at these times.
What if I said?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Jay?
I was finding my mute button. In addition to legislators, I think it's Department of Ed as well, because I mean, this is a great example right now where we're being told by the Department of Ed what our, processes will be. So it's legislators and, oh, thank you. That's what I would advocate for.
Yeah. Anything else? On any of these? Because my next question to you is, what do you want to do with all this? which is a messy question. So I'm going to narrow it down, right? That doesn't actually elicit an answer. So you developed an elevator speech with Joe and Sabrina. Oh, Ryan, go ahead.
I think you also want to add OSBA to number 1.
How could I forget?
Just because I think that might be an avenue beyond legislative and ODE or OHA right now. Just because I think the work that the school board does has merit and benefit to other school boards in the state. And so as I even think about number 2 and how what the work looks like, I think it's also giving presentations or sharing this information with other school boards. So I think that's so I think it needs to kind of be integrated into number 1 because I think it enhances or modifies number 2.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Jay?
I'm throwing something out. Maybe number 3 is professional development and board mentoring, because I'm thinking about how many new members of boards we have and what is it we're supposed to be making decisions about and doing. So I think professional development, if you mean also board mentoring of new members or mentoring of new members, is also really critical. Otherwise, too many of us sit and go, and should we be doing that? Is that our job or whatever? So that would be helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Ugh. I type really well until I'm being watched, I can tell you.
Thank you.
And maybe tough is the wrong word. Maybe critical conversations is better than tough. That's a
No,
little.
leave tough.
Okay.
Tough is good.
All right. You can do that. All right. Other thoughts?
To answer your question, I think one thing, and I'm sure there are multiple avenues, but one thing I think this could serve as a guiding document for board leadership to look for as we set agenda, prioritize topics. If we have, as we usually have, more issues and topics and points to discuss, to put on the agenda, the way to prioritize it, I believe, would be looking at this document and say, how could we further those priorities in alignment with the school board strategic goals? Which topic gets more importance and urgency?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So maybe there's a purpose statement at the top that how do you want to use this, right? And so often when I develop documents like these that are meant to be guiding documents in some way with boards, that it's helpful for you in using them in the future, and also helpful for your staff who might see these, for community members who might see these. If you want to talk about the work the board has been doing, we can develop a purpose statement for the top of this. It says the board developed these in order to do X, Y, and Z. And that part of that is to focus your own work and to act as a lens in and of itself for when you are, planning agendas and planning work that you might take on.
Yeah, and I think, this is really good. And possible intended or unintended, positively unintended or intended consequence of this, as we have this document up there as a focus for us, it will help us prioritize topics to discuss. And just as similarly to the school board goals, when we had it in this initial draft in the summer 2017, immediately after when the school improvements plans were presented to us in the fall, and we get presentations from staff, we see the goals embedded, and we see the discussion points highlighting the goals. So I could see a benefit of this document is that when we get the reports, probably staff will be looking at that and they will say, we need to make sure we're addressing equity, which they already do. Maybe there is some focus about sharing with the community and presenting the information in a language that's understandable to parents, understandable to legislators, etc. So I think this will help a lot, possibly as a way for us to know how we want the information, what's information presented and what topics to be discussed, but also how it should be or how it would be presented.
And so what I'm doing now is just taking notes. I'm not writing a purpose statement because this is not how I would do it. But what I will do is I'll draft something for you, because my recommendation will be to adopt these documents at some point, right? Which I think you probably intended to do, because why would you do all this work if you didn't intend to use it? So so I will draft something for you to I mean, we've changed a couple of things on this. I will draft a purpose statement for you. You can certainly change it, but I'll give you some place to start, and I can get that back to you, you know, before your next board meeting, certainly, so that you can finalize that and then do with it what you will, but use it as a communication tool, like Sammy was just saying. So anything else that you would want to see in that purpose statement? You know, this could be used to focus the work of the board. It can be used as a communication tool to family, staff, and other stakeholders. What else might this be used for? And if nothing else, that's also okay. Those are big things. So I'll start, why don't I start there? Yeah. And draft you something and get it back to you. So what about, okay. So we're going to use this tool to focus your work and better communicate with the public. What do you see as far as the timing of this? You've expressed that the board needs to continue to focus on its own professional development in many ways, right? There's way more ways to do that than hiring a consultant to do that. And you've done that. You've done it with staff, you've done it with consultants, you've done it through this program. You've expressed interest in doing a number of I'm going to bring up the agenda again. What are your actual tasks here, and what's your timeline? So if you are interested in focusing on public engagement and communication and those pieces that fall underneath, and racial equity and implicit bias and those pieces that fall underneath, what does this look like? For example. Oh, Vince, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we need to choose what actions. I mean, we need to identify, and you know what really popped out the last document you were showing is that, oh, this is great, this is what we're going to do, but how do we measure that? How do we measure these outcomes? And so how are we going to measure our own success in tangible terms? Is kind of, and part of that is setting up, we're going to do X and we're going to get it done by Y to date, you know, and setting up a calendar to do that.
Yep. Yeah. And so, like, for example, I would say, okay, the board needs a clear definition of public engagement. When do you want to talk about that? You know, when does that show up on an agenda? When do you decide what that is? Is that you sitting around a table coming up with a definition? Is it asking Ryan to bring you something? Is it more staff? Like, what? I don't know that we can decide what all of these pieces look like tonight, but what I would like you to do is make a plan for addressing the components of these things that you want to focus on. And maybe there are parts of this that you can say, we want to do this by this date.
And we also, in the first one, I mean, public engagement, we kind of went through an exercise of prioritizing those. So there's a prioritization component to this as well.
One of my thoughts is that as we meet in retreat, this may be a good spot for us to start, because then we can lay out timelines and actions for each one of these as we move into the school year. I feel like this is a good framing or a good time frame for us to start to develop that, because it also informs the chair and the agendas for the upcoming year. So I think that we have only one more meeting this year in June, this school year, and then we'll go into retreat in August. So I think it makes sense that would be something that we would use as a jumping off point.
Great. Good. Sarah?
Yeah, so I think also one of the benefits of waiting until we have our retreat to sort of decide on what this looks like and how we're going to measure it and all those things is, and maybe it's because frankly today I'm exhausted. I'm having a very hard time making decisions about what's going to happen in the next several months, because there's so much not known about what is going to be possible for public engagement, there's just too much unknown. It just feels too uncertain right now for me to say, okay, by this date, we're going to have this in place, because we don't know what's going to be possible.
Right.
By the time we meet and retreat, maybe things we will at least know what school will look like next year. And I think that will give us a little bit better ability to focus right now, or then rather than now.
Very good point, right? I mean, it's really hard to know what next year looks like. Sarah, I am also a parent of a child with ADHD who's having a really hard time with the school thing. I hear you. I wanted to say that earlier, but I didn't want to interrupt your meeting.
We have some real, my daughter is fabulous, wonderful. Since this is a public meeting, I should, she's fabulous and wonderful, and we have really good days.
Yep.
And like every parent, there are good days and bad days.
Yep.
I'm just on a bad day.
You're here. So I think that's great. I mean, we may not know everything in August, but we will know certainly more than we do now. And you will certainly be able, and plus a retreat is just a good time to talk about goals and setting them and timelines, et cetera. Jay, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I do. I think that in doing what is the right role of the board and good communication, I think we're partners with the superintendent, and what we do has to be in sync most of the time, I would think, with what you, Ryan, are hoping that the board does. So I think that's a conversation too, is there might be 3 different or 4 different models of board communication styles, and what would be the pluses and minuses is helpful for me, because I think it's got to be supportive, it's got to be strategic, it's got to be time manageable. Those are the things that I think we should have to keep reminding ourselves of. And maybe Vince, in your new work, you might have an example or 2 of an article to read about effective board communication that we might help ourselves a little bit. So
got an in.
Yeah, I might have an article like that.
A quote expert, I think. Yeah.
Vince, you have your hand up. Did you want to add?
No, I just didn't lower it.
Sarah.
I'm having an unmute issue. I think there are lots of models out there. I just, as we were sitting here looking at this, talking about models of what this could look like, Googled models for school board public engagement. And so I think we can find, we probably will have to make it our own because we are who we are, but we have starting points. We're not going to have to invent the wheel here. So.
Yeah. And this is in fact, something that we are working on at OSBA right now. Somebody on your board has been assigned this task of really looking at helping boards determine what their model looks like. And So that, I mean, that's something we're thinking about too. Other thoughts on any of this? I feel like I have my marching orders as to what I will go and refine and get back to you. Are you clear about how you want to use these? I mean, it sounds like the retreat is a great time to do this. You've got a jumping off point. It sounds, I mean, like part of this conversation was kind of planning your retreat even. And you've done good work. You've established what your priorities are going to be. And now it's just about like, okay, so what are the action steps here and how do we monitor those? Which is a key piece, as you know. Anything else on this? So I don't have anything else for you. What I want to say to you is this has been, and I do not say this to everybody, this has been one of the most comprehensive and rewarding PSPs that I've been a part of. You really delved deeply into something that is critically important to your students' success and well-being. And you utilized your staff expertise in a way that is really sophisticated and very collaborative, and they are amazing. I mean, like I'm like Sabrina's biggest fan. I just love everything about her. But and you came out of it with work to do for yourself and ways to talk about it with your community. There are so many aspects of that just don't always get done in the PSP. And this was just like, when I have talked about like who's doing the PSP really well, I have always said Corvallis. And so if there's an opportunity for you to share your experience and what you put into it and what you got out of it, I want to be able to invite you to do that at some point, because this kind of process is what we want out of the PSP. And I will be I'm so sad that I don't get to bring you a big novelty check and take pictures and, you know, tell the media about it, but your check is in the mail. And I look forward to hearing about how you know, what your process is for dispersing that to kids, whether you've chosen one student or multiple and how that goes. I will ask you to follow up with me on that, because we'd like to know, you know, like this is what our boards did with that. But I hope this process has been valuable to you. From the outside, I feel like you put a lot into this and just really utilized your resources and your planning, and your superintendent did such a wonderful job. I mean, like, you all just really did good work, and I just want to celebrate you. And now I'm done being mushy.
Thank you.
That's all I can do.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Jay, do you have something to say?
Two things. One, Kristen, thank you very much. Not always do we get great help from outsiders, but you have been wonderful. And thank you, Ryan and Sammy, for thinking of us and doing this, because I think it's really valuable. I'd forgotten there was money that we were going to get as well or something, but the punchline is it's good for us. And then Sammy, before we adjourn, I just had a topic to talk about for just briefly, but didn't want to lose the group.
Absolutely, we'll get to this. Anything would you all want to share with Kristen as we conclude the training?
Of course, any feedback is great. Like, if there were parts of this that you would want us to change or that didn't quite work for you, like, I mean, you don't have to tell me right now, but I just want you to know that, like, all feedback, we use it. We really do.
Absolutely. Well, Kristen, I want to highlight one thing. This scholarship program has been very valuable for us. Really thank you to you personally and to OSBA for providing this opportunity. If I'm not mistaken, the money is $5,000, and to reiterate, it's a student scholarship. So the school board committed to 5 sessions of trainings, and this is the last training that last session and within the year. And based on that, we have the scholarship money that we will be providing to one or more of our students. So it's been a really great opportunity, and thanks to our school board members and the staff for the commitment to this training, and for you for this opportunity. Really appreciated. It's been very valuable.
I will miss working with you.
Likewise.
One of you.
All right, seeing none, thank you so much, Kristen. That concludes the training. It's been very, very great. And every time we go through these trainings, I'm very, very glad. So a round of applause through the screen. All right,
And thank you. It's been good.
Good. Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Your little hands there. That's very cute. Bye.
Take care. All right, that gets us to the board member comments. And Jay, you're up next.
Gosh. So the two comments I would make is that as a person who gets to be a student teacher supervisor in the Mid-Valley that includes Salem and Yamhill and Albany and Corvallis, I just have to tell you that it is amazing what's going on in schools and what the challenge. It is gigantic at the high school level. I can speak only to that. And it brings me to my concern or next steps. I talked with Sarah a little bit earlier in the week. We all got an email, I think, from some person who watched the board meeting the budget meeting, and said she was disheartened. She happened to be a teacher. And frankly, I am very disheartened about the quality of education that we're able to deliver in a lockdown or whatever you want to call this terrible time. And it got worse when I went and visited some relatives in Washington who are really, really good high school teachers, and they shared that it's no better there. It is very, very difficult, both in terms of engaging, because great teachers are great at engaging, but it doesn't happen over the web. It happens in classes. And also, frankly, the story got worse when one of them said she was getting about 40% feedback on her online classes. And when she called homes, many of the kids were working. And it was in an agricultural community. And I think that's just an example of how engaging is in the eyes of the beholder. And those guys were engaged in working and making money, and school was way down the line in terms of learning. Which brings me to the point of what is our board role in raising the concern. I think we have a wonderful staff, a great set of leaders, and we're trying the best we can. But someone, in my humble opinion, it's my job, and you can join me if you want, needs to raise with both the Department of Ed and the legislature our perspective that this is not a great way to do education. And I know that there must be a right way to do, and maybe there's several right ways to raise it. And I have kind of fallen to the point of saying, I know you can do resolutions and we could debate hours and hours about the right elements. But frankly, I think what I'd like to do, and I'm announcing this, is I'm going to send a letter, and I will send you a copy. And if you want to join and sign it as an individual board member, not as a board, my concerns. And if you want to push back and say, no, Jay, that's not appropriate board communication, let me know. But it would be directed to legislators and to the Department of Ed that we really cannot do fall school like we're doing the last 3 months, unless you can just show me this ungodly health change that's just even worse than what we've been through. It's just really not good education. And I feel that's part of our job as a board member to raise that. So anyway, I will be happy to circulate a letter, and you can tell me where I'm wrong, and you can add your signature if you want, but I just wanted to give you a heads up. That's what I had decided that I have to do.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jay. I appreciate it. Ryan would like to add something.
So the only thing I would add is that if you're going to want to send a letter like that, Jay, it's actually the Oregon Health Authority is where you're probably going to want to share that information. Right now, all of our guidance that we're following is coming through OHA. And I think that will be the case well into the future. When I had conversations with, this was the second time I've done a district-wide staff meeting through this format with hundreds of people on and asking questions. One of the things I shared is that I don't anticipate that the fall will look like other falls. We had a meeting yesterday with the head of OHA, and that was the conversation there as well. We're talking about how to be resilient and how to shift throughout next school year in terms of the design and the model of educational delivery. And so those are the things we have staff working on right now. So we are aware that the fall is not going to look like other falls that we've had in school. And so we're working right now. We have established a structure of teams to work towards that. But the people that are making the decisions right now in terms of what that's going to look like is OHA.
But I guess, thank you for that heads up. I absolutely understand. And I think it's not unlike a lot of policy decisions that get done. They cannot be the only people that are quote in charge of those decisions without good input. So, I mean, I respect decision making, but I also know that input has to be heard from people who are accountable. So just, I'm throwing that out as the Department of Ed still might be a spot, as might be legislators. So thank you.
I think including legislators on any of that kind of communication is also vital as we potentially go into a special session where budget decisions are made.
Right.
Because demands on schools are going to require funding, and we need to be able to advocate for that really strongly. I was at the ESD by Zoom budget committee meeting this week. Budget committee meetings are not fun right now. So we need to all be able to do everything we can to advocate for what we need to be able to educate next year safely and well. So my comment for the end of this meeting was, I apologize for maybe oversharing in my exhaustion today, but I'm hearing from lots of parents, teachers who are parents, families are exhausted right now. Teachers are exhausted right now. I would just ask everyone who in the community, if you're watching, if you're paying attention, to please give our teachers and students grace, because this has been a long haul. And as I said about myself, reserves have run out. And we're doing the best we can in a situation that was forced upon us very quickly. And, you know, I told my daughter today, sometimes it's okay just to say, today I can't do this. Because there are some days where that's way healthier than trying to turn in that last assignment. So it's just, I think things have, I think last week it felt like people were sort of in a groove, and this week it feels like, no, we're just tired. So, but we'll keep going forward.
Thank you, Sarah. And I really appreciate you sharing this. It just reminds me of the book that we got earlier this year, their leadership with vulnerability. And it's very important for us to really share our vulnerabilities as a source of a strength for us to see how we can navigate this and how we can relate to each other's experiences. And I share your plea to the community members to give each other a grace because we all need it. It's been very difficult and very challenging, and the only way we can get through this is together, by supporting each other, and by knowing we will have some really difficult days and some better ones. And all what we can do is navigate through it and hope for a better day tomorrow, every day. Thank you. Anything else you would like to share? All right, I do have one update for you. If you have your calendars or notes, we will send you a calendar update, but I just want you to know that on May 28th, we will have a short special session at 5:15 p.m. So that's May 28th at 5:15 p.m. So that will be a special meeting before our budget meeting. So block your calendar at 5:15 p.m. and Julie will send you an invite. All right, Sarah?
Sorry, my other thing now I'm remembering is to ask if, I mean, usually board members shake graduates' hands and hand out diplomas. So I just want to let Ryan know if there's any role that the board needs, if you need board members to play or an opportunity for us to play in graduations, to please let us know, because we want to do what we can to celebrate those kids who are making it through this year.
Thank you for raising that, Sarah.
Yeah, so Julie sent out an email, I think just probably since we've been meeting, just asking you which graduation ceremonies you wanted to be a part of. As you know, this year they will look a little different, but we're excited to be able to honor our graduates with a car parade and the opportunity to collect their diploma at their home high schools. And then Wings will be doing a graduation ceremony through Zoom. So there'll be an opportunity to recognize our seniors and our graduates in a different fashion. And so we will, we're just right now wanting to identify from you which ceremonies you would like to be a part of. And then with the numbers and some of those things, we'll get back to you as we disperse board members, so we have representation at each graduation. And at the same time, we keep our numbers smaller than usual. So that's information we're working on right now. And it has been really great to see community wanting to be involved and support and recognize our graduates. It's been a fun experience to be able to go and knock on doors and hand t-shirts and lawn signs out to seniors, and also just to kind of think about how to do this in a creative way that honors and recognizes their 13 years with us.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Sarah, for mentioning this. Yeah, I'm looking forward for, I'm going to sign up for all of them. And most importantly, it's just really great to see those lawn signs across town with the high school seniors' names. If anyone or any parents of them listens to this, we're so proud. And this is the highlights of my day whenever I need to go for a walk or have to drive for an essential thing and see those lawn signs across town. That reminds me why we are here, why we're doing this business. It's for those seniors to graduate and to be celebrated and to really navigate through the future and be the hope for a better future in these times. So congratulations, seniors, and we're looking forward to see you soon from a distance. All right, anything else for the good of the order? All right, seeing none, we'll see you on May 28th at 5:15 p.m. and then shortly after for the budget meeting. Thank you all. You take care.
Good night.
Good night.